Give us a sense of your district. It's the Inland Empire outside of Los Angeles. Talk a little bit about who lives there and what they're going through.
Absolutely. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. The district that I represent, I would say it's really no different than Ryan's district or Cheri's district. Our economy is growing and we are recovering from the recession, but we have a diversity of workers that either you're high wage earners driving 50, 60 miles one way to work in Los Angeles, Orange County, or northern San Diego, or you're a minimum wage part-time worker working in logistics. It's a really tough economy. Our housing, dropped terrible during the recession. We have some neighborhoods were completely vacant during that time. And now we have a growing homeless population because we are the suburbs of Los Angeles. So housing prices are growing, they're higher, and our people are being displaced by higher wage earners that are driving to Los Angeles.
Congresswoman Bustos, as you know, one of the places that we traveled to, John talked about yesterday, was to your district, and we learned a lot about that. You represent one of those districts that went for Obama and then went for Trump, and that a Democrat has managed to hold on to. Talk a little bit about what's happening there and the politics of your district.
Yeah, and you'll hear a pretty vast contrast, I think, between Congressman Himes' district and mine. We were just talking about what a family of four makes. A typical family of four in the congressional district I represent in, which covers the entire northwest corner of the state of Illinois, is $45,000. And that'll give you an idea. We had plants like Maytag in Galesburg, Illinois, that 15 years ago, in September, shipped every last job over to Mexico. That story could be repeated over and over, whether you're in the northern part of my congressional district or in the southern part. It's an ag economy. Where I live in the town of Moline, Illinois, it's the world headquarters for John Deere. And so you can think about with these tariffs, how we're dealing with China, that we have made Canada and Mexico are enemies all of a sudden, and how farmers can grow a bushel of soybeans and it costs them more to grow it than what they're going to be getting for that. So we're an economy that is going through tough times again. And I think the way to characterize, I'm going to share just one quick story, and I think this says it all. I do something we call Cheri on Shift, where I job shadow people and get to know people at a deeper level, stand shoulder to shoulder with whatever it is they're doing, a welder, a carp processor, a forklift driver, whatever it may be. And I was with a home care nurse who's married to a gentleman who works for one of the cities. They have 2 young children. And I like to ask the question, what do you do for fun? Because it gets to people's disposable income, and without being rude and saying, what do you make or anything like that. This woman said, we have cable television. And I bring that up because you think about what so many of us take for granted. This is a family that they can't even think about going to Disney World. But at least they have the Disney Channel, and that is what they do for fun. And so I think that is a good way to characterize the congressional district that I serve and the people that I serve.
And Congressman Himes, as we noted, your district spans the range of possibilities in the United States. Talk a little bit about the kind of Bridgeport to Greenwich divide.
Yeah, I've got a fascinating district. At one level, it can be sort of characterized as your classic Democratic coastal district. We are that, but it's a lot more interesting than that. I mean, I've got an enormously affluent district, but I've also got the city of Bridgeport. So I've got, Greenwich, Westport, New Canaan, Darien, these iconic, affluent names. I've also got the city of Bridgeport, which is the largest city in Connecticut, and actually a meaningful portion of the city lives in poverty. We have all of the challenges of urban poverty. We also have one of the most immigration-intensive districts in the country. So it's as diverse as it gets, and negotiating those differences is a fascinating thing. But there are certain things that are true about it. It is a New England district, a coastal district, so it tends to be socially, not uniformly, but quite liberal. It's a business district, so it's probably a little bit more fiscally oriented than your average Democratic district. And of course, 20 years ago it was a solid Republican district. It's indicative of what happened in New England as the Republican Party changed. Traditional, old school establishment Republican places became much bluer.
And let me just follow up with you. Your district went for Obama by 11 and for Hillary by 23 points. Would that all such districts were around? What is the imperative, do you think, for Democrats in a district like that? Do you need to focus only on firing up your base? You have a plus 23 district. Or do you think you can talk to people about things that are a little bit more broad in their appeal?
Well, it's a disorienting thing for me because, again, prior to my win in 2008, this had been a Republican district. This was, and by the way, interesting group of Republicans, a sort of species that doesn't exist anymore. My predecessor was Chris Shays. I'd call him a liberal Republican. Prior to that, Stu McKinney, a lot more liberal than a lot of Democrats would be today. And so when I won in 2008, it really was a very purple place. And, I spent terms worried about the general election. Now, particularly with the polarization and particularly with what Donald Trump has done to areas like that, and he has generated an almost, in my district, and this is why the numbers were what you said, he's generated a universal sense of revulsion. I'll illustrate that by saying New Canaan and Darien. These are not particularly diverse communities. Most folks living in these towns look a lot like me, but they are very Republican. I will never win those two towns, but those two towns, which are my most Republican towns, voted for Hillary Clinton. These are the Republicans that we kind of wonder nationally, where did they go? Because they started out not being particularly supportive of Donald Trump. And they remain that way. So the challenge in my district today is more about keeping a sense of practical unity in the party. I have a lot of affluent Democrats who are so emotionally angry right now. Some of them go the path of, we've got to answer. It was interesting to hear the themes earlier. We've got to answer the anger and the extremism of Donald Trump with our own version of that. Keeping the party together is not getting too concerned about the little tiny differences that we want to scream at each other about. That today is probably my biggest challenge.
So, Congressman Bustos, in some way you have the inverse of that. You never had the Chris Shays Republicans. They used to roam the plains like the buffalo, but they were hunted into extinction. But you've got a district that, as you noted, is struggling or on the brink of struggling economically, and yet went massively for Trump. So how do you explain that? What about the Trump economic narrative, leave aside the other stuff, do you think landed with the people in your district, and can that be changed?
I mentioned Maytag, and Maytag sending every last one of its about 1,200 jobs over to Mexico. And I also said that story could be repeated numerous other times. In my first race in 2011 and 2012, there was a company called Sensata that made these automotive sensors in Freeport, Illinois. And Bain Capital had bought that out in a leveraged buyout and made a decision to send all of those jobs over to China. It ended up getting international attention because, of course, Mitt Romney and his association with Bain Capital. And the last job for a woman I got to know pretty well, her name's Dot Turner. She had worked there right out of high school, and she was now in her 60s. And her last job at that plant was to get on her hands and knees and scrape the tape off the floor that had been there to lay the groundwork for where the machinery went. All right, so and again, those stories could be told over and over. And so when Donald Trump, I know it was when he had this message that was directed at an African-American audience when he said, "What have you got to lose?" I think that people in a congressional district like mine who had voted for President Obama in 2008 and 2012 went into the voting booth and thought that Hillary Clinton was talking about just continuing to make things better, and people weren't feeling that things were better. So I think they heard that message and thought, what do we have to lose? and decided to try. And we, the term Trump triers, which I use that repeatedly. I think it needs to be attributed to Jim Kessler because it was in your guys' report. But I use that repeatedly because I think that summarizes how people in a congressional district like mine felt. I ended up winning by 20 points. In a Trump district, there are now 13 Democrats. Connor Lamb was the 13th. There had just been 12 who are serving in Congress from these Trump districts. And how we have to navigate that politically is very different. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time to go into that, but Robin Johnson, who's a political science professor from Monmouth, Illinois at Monmouth College, he's in the audience here somewhere, but he and I partnered and wrote this report, Hope from the Heartland, and interviewed 72 Democrats in 8 Midwestern states who survived this era that Senator Coons talked about, where we've lost 1,000 seats over the last decade. And we talked to these 72 Democrats who survived, and there are some great lessons in there if anybody wants to know politically how you survive these very tough swing districts. And it really can be summarized. You listen to people, you meet people like Dot Turner, who I just mentioned, and get to know her at a deeper level and share those stories. And I think even more importantly, when a Democrat is elected, that we go out to Washington or to our state capitals, whatever job that we're in, and we do something about it. Again, I mean, I told you what the family of 4 makes in my congressional district. As a member of Congress, I make about 4 times what they do. So I better work darn hard. I better fight for them when there's a fight to be had, and I better get results. Doesn't matter that I'm in the minority party, and I think that's hopefully a reflection of why people ended up voting for me and Trump.
To your point about listening, I want to relate one thing that I learned yesterday, and I facilitated 2 of the sessions on telling a resonant political story, and in both sessions, people insisted that the most important thing to telling a story was listening. And I found that to be really interesting. Congresswoman Torres, kind of the inverse of what Congresswoman Bustos was saying is true in yours. There was a lot for people in your district to lose. It's 71% Latino and Hispanic. And yet you just told me that in the recent statewide races, people voted for Republicans. What is going on?
Right. This is a county that it took us 14 years to turn a red county into a Democratic blue county. But yet in this last election, I think our voters have really felt left out that our party isn't communicating with them. So when they came out and voted, they didn't necessarily voted like the rest of California did. And they voted for statewide Republicans, double digits. That is a problem. And if we don't see that as a problem as Democrats, progressive Democrats in California, then I think that we have a terrible reality that we're going to be facing coming
Do you have a sense of why? What is going on in a district like yours that would move people in this moment when the party has been completely hijacked by Trump at every level, and everyone is associated with Trump who has an R next to their name? Why are they voting for Republicans?
I think prior to President Trump's election, we saw the Tea Party flags go up, right? Well, now those have come down, but the pink hats have gone up. And it's the same type of rhetoric, one extreme to the other extreme. That's not what helps a middle-aged male or a female who is the head of her household deliver groceries, to the table or pay for rent. My folks want to talk about jobs, and they want to talk about sustainability. They want to talk about not having to drive those 60, 70 miles one way, and they're tired of being taxed. We have had so many ballot initiatives, and I don't think that we have taken the time to educate our voters on the pay-fors for all of those wonderful things that we want to do in California. So the reality is that moderate Democrats is how we won the Inland Empire, and it's going to take moderate Democrats to sustain it for the future.
As chairman of the New Democrats, would you like to respond to that?
Well, yeah. There's a lot there to respond to, but one word in particular that keeps coming up that we don't spend enough time on, that has now come up in this conversation twice. 2 words: stories and values. we make a terrible mistake as Democrats by saying, it's all about our policies and our message, right? So policies, we have this belief that if we just have the right 12-point health care plan, we'll win, and maybe it's 9 points, and yes, policy is important, and yes, message is important, but we completely miss the boat, and Norma was sort of alluding to this, on jiving with people's values. And we could go on for 30 minutes on this, but let me make it very, very crisp. The people make their decisions not based on whether your healthcare plan is better than the other one. It's basically a sense of, does this person share my values? My African American churches, there's a wonderful phrase, nobody cares what's in your head until they know what's in your heart. And we don't ever do that. We don't tell the stories, we don't have the values. Or not that we don't have the values, we don't speak that language. The thumbnail sketch of the values underlying our parties are really good stories. The Republicans say, it is individuals and in a context of liberty that create businesses and wealth and symphonies and poetry. And we say, yeah, but the amazing stuff that we do is the stuff that we do together when we sacrifice for each other. Those are good stories. And we put an or between them, and we don't talk about them. If we're going to broadly appeal to people in all three of our very, very different districts, we're going to, first of all, start speaking those languages. If we're going to govern without these massive swings, we're going to acknowledge that the other side, we're going to say and instead of or, we're going to acknowledge that the other side, that there is a powerful story about individual liberty. So what are we doing right now? We're having these tiny little discussions within our own communities, about is it single payer or not single payer? Is it reform ICE or abolish ICE? We're having these internal family feuds, ignoring the fact that folks, certainly in Cheri's district, don't actually hear us talking about the things that are a part of their great story about individual liberty, about the things, let's not even get started on questions of faith and religion where we're blind. But anyway, my point is that what reconciles districts as different and as diverse as ours are is when we finally get our act together to understand that we've got to start talking about values, not arguing the little infinitesimal differences in the values that we have, but actually expanding into accepting, working with the values that other people have, that these values of individual liberty, and making people believe that we get where they come from.
Congressman Bustos, to that exact point, one of the things that we heard in your district and in a lot of other places was that Democrats are describing a world that they don't recognize, that they don't live in, that we're talking about sending kids to college, every kid to college for free. All right, that's fine if your kid is destined for college, but is that one of the things that you hear at home? And if so, what are the kinds of things that you think Democrats need to do to reconnect in the way that Congressman Himes was talking about?
The term coastal elite does come up, no offense to my coastal friends. But really, in the coast?
Well,
that's really bad.
coastal elite.
Oh, okay, but
As
the
in
other
that,
coast,
yeah.
not your coast.
Well, our coastal Democrats in
Yeah.
California, we have a large coast too.
What I so appreciate about what Third Way is doing, you guys came to Columbus, Ohio. Who else does that? Because Robin Johnson, who I brought up earlier, who, by the way, I've known since I was a teenager. He ran my first race for city council. He's one of my closest advisors. And I'll tell you what, for anybody here who's running in any kind of rural district, and this is not a plug for Robin, but we talk about this a lot. We've got these, I won't even call out any certain university or anything, but to understand heartland politics, you got to get in the heartland. And again, that's why I so appreciate the fact that your first trip, Third Way's first trip after 2016, when you were trying to figure out what in the heck went wrong, was to Peoria, Illinois, and Moline, Illinois, because that's where you're gonna find out exactly what's going on. The politics are very different. I couldn't agree more deeply with what Jim Himes just said about values. Here's where we will not go wrong. We will not go wrong if we talk about the fact that people need to make a better wage right now. Again, think about that. A family of four making $45,000, that's tough. That is tough. And they, believe me, when they're going home at the end of the day, and I love Tim Ryan's phrase about showering after work. I happen to have a son who's a welder. I don't think there's a whole lot of members of Congress who have a kid who's a welder. Well, he's a welder, and he does shower after work. I can tell you, he's not going home and talking about impeachment. He's not going home and saying or talking about Russia, and he certainly wouldn't be going, yeah, abolish ICE. That is not what he's talking about. He and his wife, who works for a medical clinic, they were talking about the other day about how much will it cost to join the YMCA, and that's the thing that they're talking about. So where we don't go wrong is to talk about making sure that people make a good wage, making sure that we address the cost of health care, that come October, everybody in America is going to hear about how these rates for health insurance are going to be going up double digits. And then lastly, and I don't talk about this a ton at home, but we need to straighten up how Washington operates. I mean, it is a mess. The number one thing I hear when I do these supermarket Saturdays and walk the aisles and just say, hey, what's on your mind, is just get something done. That is the number one thing I hear. And they want Democrats and Republicans to work together. They want us to solve problems. They want us to fight for them when whatever it is that the fight should be. And I don't think it gets a whole lot more complicated than that. Work hard, be honest, fight for people. That's the essence of somebody good at public service.
Well, you've teed up publicly my next question for Councilwoman Torres. What's the number one thing you hear when you go home?
The number one thing that I hear about, that is happening in my community is the lack of training opportunities for displaced workers. All of our manufacturers have left. Once again, we've become a logistics-driven community, and while some advanced manufacturing is coming back, those employers are finding themselves with a workforce that is not trained. So part of it is I need to be able to access a community college, get a certificate, join a program where I can get a certificate so I can get the basic knowledge of this job, so I can get out of the warehouse work where I'm breaking my back and get into a more sustainable job. But it's interesting, in my community, I talked about the Tea Party flags. I get protesters in my district office as many hugs and kisses as I get at the grocery store. So it's a balancing act. It's being approachable with people, that when I'm shopping for my weekly groceries when I get home, because my husband doesn't cook and there isn't a single fresh item in the refrigerator, people notice that. They're like, oh, how long are you home for? I don't see a full grocery cart. And they want to know what's going on in Washington. What they don't ask about is they don't ask about Russia. As important as we think that it may be to them, as important as trade is to my district, because let's face it, everything that comes through the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach ends up in my district, where it gets redistributed throughout the U.S. They're not talking about trade. They don't like trade. They don't like trade, even though those are the jobs that they're working in right now. But the reason why they don't like trade is because they see it as we lost half of our income as a result. They don't necessarily see the nexus that they are truck drivers and they have this job because of trade. So talking about those issues has become very, very difficult.
Because you all were in Washington doing your jobs yesterday, you weren't able to hear, but we talked quite a bit about how globalization feels like a real headwind for a lot of people, even people for whom it actually isn't. But it feels that way, and that's what's their reality. I do want to state for the record that I never get hugs or kisses at the grocery store.
It's the oddest thing.
Yeah,
but
I'm sure. Congresswoman Torres raised a really interesting point. You are a senior member of the Intelligence Committee. You're on television every day talking about what is an enormously important thing that occupies the minds of everyone in here all the time. What advice do you give to new Democrats who are out there running? Do you think they should be talking about it or not?
The advice I give to everybody in a non-presidential race is talk about, in an authentic way, using emotions and stories and values, the thing that matters to your constituents. And Cheri and I have a running routine. I've sort of said this on TV before. my more affluent, educated voters, and that is by far not all that is in my district, are obsessed with the constitutional questions, with the Russia story, and they make their opinions known, and I spend time talking to them about it. And Cheri and I's joke is, on Monday when we see each other, Jim, my folks still aren't asking me about Russia, and it's a hard problem, right? Because the threat to the democratic institutions and systems in this country is very real, and this is one of those Winston Churchill moments for Americans to stand up and say, this is not the way we do things in this country. But if that's all we do, we will lose, because as Norma and Cheri just said, the folks that we need to vote for us, the folks that we have either ignored or alienated, that's not their top concern. So the answer to that question is, if you're going to win, if you're going to be a good Democrat, you're going to be authentic, you're going to tell stories, and you're going to both listen to people about what they worry about and then talk to them about that.
We're going to do something very undemocratic with a capital D, is try to stay on time. So we could talk for another hour to this incredible group, but please join me in thanking this great group of members of Congress.